Guitar is the instrument of the latter half of the 20th century, and now it's so ubiquitous that it feels like it's almost always been there in a sense. If you listen to rock and roll, the blues, pop, folk, country, classical, basically if it's a non-electronic genre, there's gonna be guitar there, and sometimes it's very front and center. The story of guitar is the story of humanity. It's an epic story, and it's one that's gonna take us back to some of the earliest civilizations, and even beyond that. There's violence, romance, technical craftsmanship, and this journey will take us to the heights of curiosity and creativity, and also the depths of conflict and cruelty. I'm David Hughes, this is Charcuterie Sound, and this week we're looking at the history of the guitar. So grab a drink, grab a snack, and let's dive in. Many thousands of years ago, before metalworking, before cities, even before humans settled in agricultural societies, the first step in our guitar journey begins. And it begins with a hunt. For the vast majority of our existence, we gathered plants and fungi and harvested wildlife from the sea and the land. And these animal resources provided our ancestors with more than just calories. They also provided the raw materials necessary for early technological complexes. Hides for clothing, bones for tools and weapons, and proteins and pigments used in the creation of art and self-decoration. But there are two particular resources that are important for our story: sinew and gut, which in the case of sinew, when cleaned, dried, smashed into separate fibers, and braided into cordage, has an incredible number of uses. One of which is to hold the flex of a durable piece of wood with the intention of launching projectiles. These, of course, were the first bows, and the projectiles the first arrows. So I don't know if you've ever tried your hand at archery. It's a lot of fun, it's very difficult, and one thing that you do know if you've loosed a few arrows is that when you release the string, it makes a sound. It makes a pluck sound, like a boing kind of thing. Not quite that cartoonish. That is, if it doesn't hit your wrist on the way by, and then it's going to be you making the sound, and that sound will be But this pluck sound is something that early hunter-gatherers would have noticed as well. They had daily exposure to these objects. And I know it sounds really weird, but you can actually change the sound of that pluck if you press the end of the bow against your cheek or put it inside your mouth. Kind of like this. Let's take a listen for a second. That has a really kind of cool, haunting sound. But there's a cave painting in the Trafford cave in France that kind of depicts this. It looks to depict this. It's kind of still hotly debated. What's not being debated by scholars is that the mouth bow is clearly one of the oldest, if not the oldest, stringed instrument that humanity ever had contact with. So we have a string to be plucked, we have a resonating chamber, and we have a wooden frame. The real difference is that with an acoustic guitar, to change the pitch, you don't change the shape of the resonating chamber, you change the length of the string, kind of. One second. By pinching the string at a certain fret, instead of being this long vibrating string, you get a shorter vibrating string from the pinch point to here instead of from there to here. So there are a few very important differences between the mouth bow and the modern acoustic guitar, but there's also a lot of similarities. The next chapter in our story takes us to the royal cemeteries of one of humanity's first great cities. This is the Sumerian city-state of Ur in Mesopotamia, or what's now modern Iraq. Mesopotamia, by the way, just means between rivers, and in this case, that's the Tigris and the Euphrates. So here in Ur, the royalty is extremely powerful, and the kings and queens of Ur are magnificently wealthy. But as everybody knows, all the wealth in the world can't protect you from the inevitable. And when a king or queen dies in Ur, it is bad news for many. Attendants, consorts, musicians were often interred with their leader to continue serving them in the afterlife. Kind of grisly. They're also often buried with everyday items that they might need in the afterlife, like jars or cups, stools, and of course, musical instruments. And these are not just any musical instruments. These are the incredibly crafted and beautifully decorated royal lyres of Ur. And they're some of the earliest stringed instruments that we've ever recovered. And they're also just they're so pretty. And a lyre is a significantly more complex instrument than our mouth bow. It's also significantly closer to a modern guitar. Particularly what I find interesting is due to a level of standardization and the complexity of these instruments, they're clearly part of a much older tradition. We're just meeting it here in Ur. The unfortunate bit is that wood survives pretty poorly in the archaeological record compared to, metal or stone. So we're so lucky to have these instruments, which are preserved because of the arid environment that they were buried in. Because of this, we can peer into the musical lives of people born deep in the past, hundreds of generations ago. Now we have multiple strings tuned to different notes. We have a static wooden resonating chamber, and we have some level of standardization in the construction. We're already somewhere pretty familiar. I find it absolutely fascinating to imagine expert ancient musicians playing these beautiful instruments. And it was already part of a much older tradition of stringed instruments, and it's a tradition that continues to today, which is crazy. Think about that next time someone breaks out a buzzing, muted version of Wonderwall at a party. So this part of the story gets a little bit tricky. You see, with ancient stringed instruments, there are two main kind of clusters of morphology. There's the lyres, which we've already looked at, and then there's the proto-lutes. Proto just meaning kind of prior to, early lutes. And it's this family of proto-lutes that causes the issue. Well, it's only really an issue if you expected this story to be a linear progression from prehistory to Eddie Van Halen. It's a lot more murky than that. On this channel, it's never that type of story. So the Mesopotamians, which we're already talking about, it's kind of even crazy just to say Mesopotamians because it covers such a long period of time and so many diverse cultures. But that's probably a different episode and honestly probably a different channel. But the Mesopotamians had these long-necked lutes, these long-necked proto-lutes. It's generally thought that they post-date the lyre, but that's only because we don't have any surviving proto-lutes. And these proto-lutes are more like a banjo than a guitar. It's a long rod or neck that pierces through a turtle shell or a gourd. Although because of the construction of these proto-lutes, they can't handle a lot of tension. It's this problem of tension, and this will come up over and over. But both the lyre and the long-necked lute, what proto-lutes would become, they spread out from the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, and we see them as far as China in the east and as far as Spain in the west. But if we're looking for the most likely direct ancestors of the guitar, we should really probe India and Greece. So by at least the 4th century BCE, the long-necked lute arrives in Greece. And don't worry, this isn't one of those videos where I talk about the Greeks as if they're the ultimate ancient civilization. But they did have an interesting stringed instrument called the pandura, a clear descendant from the long-necked lute. The interesting thing about this instrument is that the pandura, or a predecessor of it, was likely the instrument used by ancient Greeks to figure out the mathematics of tuning. So like many things in the Western canon, our foundational views of tuning come down to us by the Greeks through the Romans. And their early understanding of tuning was just a simple ratio, that if you have a string and you reduce the length of that string by half, then it will be a note that is 1 octave higher. Let me demonstrate. Again, hold on. We have the string at its full length. Ooh, that doesn't sound very good, but we have the string at its half length. Same note, it's just 1 octave higher. So Pythagorean tuning is extremely useful, but it's not perfect. Certain intervals just sound really bad. Major thirds don't sound really good. A good example of a major third is the intro to Oobla-Dee, Oobla-Da by the Beatles. You can't do that on your Pythagorean tuned pandura. So if you wanted to start an ancient Greek cover band of the Beatles, I'm sorry, you can't. You can't do it. It would take generations of mathematicians and musicians in Europe, and actually at the same time in China, to discover equal temperament. It goes through further evolutions and advancements, but this is the general idea that the tuning we use today is based on. So that sets us on the path to modern tuning and how you would tune your guitar today, but we still have a body problem. A three-body problem, actually, if you will. So we have the long neck lutes, which are problematic because they can't handle a lot of tension. But they're still useful because they can play multiple sounds on one string, unlike the lyre, which, like guitars, has a large wooden resonating chamber and different strings that have different notes. And like a modern guitar, it can handle the tension of multiple strings, but it's because of a crossbar. And then we have what is probably the best candidate for the direct ancestor of the modern guitar, and that is the Northern Indian almond-shaped or short-necked lute. This instrument solved the problem of string tension just by being super thick. And while of course this is not a guitar yet, things are looking progressively more familiar. So these short-necked lutes from India, they need a few changes before they enter guitar territory. In order to do that, they're going to have to go through Persia and North Africa, and then eventually into Spain. And for that to happen, we need a bit of, well, violent conflict. And this is due to the expansion of Islam and the Umayyad Caliphate. And if you're a history nerd like me, you're probably low-key obsessed with the Umayyad Caliphate. They just conquered so much land so quickly. They solidified control in northern Africa and quickly set their eyes on Spain, or really the entire Iberian Peninsula. So this is a massive land grab of very productive land in Spain. So besides conquering, the Umayyads were also the torchbearers of a cultural package, an Islamic cultural package that included the oud, which is the Arabic version of that North Indian short-necked lute. And it was their European capital of Cordoba that became a hub for thinkers and creatives from all around the Islamic world and beyond. And the oud would continue to develop here in Spain with schools and specialized craftsmen bringing the complexity and level of standardization of the oud to new heights. And this spirit of inventiveness when it comes to music and musical instruments would continue after the Reconquista of Spain by the Christians. But the early Spanish medieval lutes are very much like a fretted oud. And these still had movable frets, and that's because of the shortcomings of the Pythagorean tuning system that we talked about earlier. And with these medieval lutes, we really are getting very close to the guitar, but yet again, we are not quite there. There's a few things we still need. And really, it all goes back to one of the oldest problems when creating stringed instruments. If you want your stringed instrument to produce clear, loud, and consistent notes, you need tension. And this is a very slowly solved engineering problem with stringed instruments in general. It's pretty difficult to get a stringed instrument with that level of tension that doesn't collapse in on itself. And adding more strings just makes this problem worse. And so far we've seen a few solutions to this problem, or semi-solutions. You can protect against that strain with a strong crossbar, like a lyre, or you can have the neck of the instrument pierce through the resonating chamber to add a little bit of stability, like the long neck lutes. And also then you can make the neck shorter and more sturdy, like the Northern Indian almond-shaped lutes and the oud. And again, this isn't necessarily a one after the other development of instruments. The medieval lute maintained its popularity throughout medieval Europe, even as proto-guitars started to become popular as well. This is where the profession of luthier really comes into play. And as you might have guessed, a luthier is someone who makes lutes. The term would later go on to mean anybody who creates bowed or plucked instruments. But the luthiers of medieval and Renaissance Spain were something special. And it's in Spain around the 15th century that these new forms, they just explode in popularity. There was the vihuela, which looks pretty damn guitar-like. And then there's these two other instruments, the guitarra latina and the guitarra morisca. It's the Latin and Moorish guitars. But hang on, because guitarra, kitara, these are all different words that describe a very large pool of stringed instruments at the time. It's not necessarily an indication that we've arrived at an instrument that you can play Wonderwall on. But this is the Renaissance, so it didn't take long for these various forms to coalesce into something that was more or less a guitar. Well, at least a very close predecessor of what would become the baroque guitar, which is still very different from the guitar I have over there. It has stronger internal bracing, which allows it to have a flat back rather than the curved back of ouds and lutes. We have standardized tuning. Well, it seems like there are three main tunings that any guitar player worth their salt would have to know. Oh, and those 5 strings are actually, they're sets of double strings. So it's actually a 10-string guitar, but those sets are tuned to the same notes. Conceptually 5 strings, but literally 10. So this guitar has frets. They're still movable because we're still haunted by these funky medieval tuning systems. The resonating chamber looks pretty similar to a modern guitar. It's a little slimmer, looks almost like a giant ukulele, I think. So this is a guitar, but in a lot of really important ways, it's still very different from a modern guitar. Of course, it has those double sets of strings, which still give it that jangly lute sound. If you play guitar, you know that most guitars have 6 strings, not 5, and not 10. And of course, the strings are still made out of animal resources, in this case, gut. Modern strings made out of gut or intestine are usually called catgut, and I have no idea why. I did not research that, but it is not made from cats. It's not made from cats. But just like our mouth bow, we're still using animal tissue to produce sound. It's kind of crazy. And I know this is a little anticlimactic, this first entry into the world of guitar, but history isn't hurtling towards some sort of endpoint, unless you mean the inevitable heat death of the universe. I mean, come on, it's pretty interesting that these amazing instruments of the Baroque period can be traced all the way back to our prehistoric ancestors. To me, that's really cool, and if you don't think so, you're wrong. In part 2 of this story, we're going to be looking at how the Baroque guitar transformed into both the modern acoustic and electric guitars that we know today. A story that has moments that are just as surprising and fascinating as our journey so far. But that's it for today. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already, if you find topics like this interesting, and leave a comment if there's some glaring omission, which I'm sure there was, or if you have ideas about things that you'd like to see in future videos. But that's all for now, so as always, stay curious, keep listening, and I'll see you next time.